Playing Through the Pain, the Impact of Secrets and Dark Knowledge.
Thank you. Yeah, 21 years, and one day I'll get a real job. It'll be great. In those 21 years, not only has it been a privilege, an incredible privilege, to be able to speak in this space on behalf of the higher values of this community, but to become friends and colleagues with so many incredible people. And over the years, many of them have shared the stories of their lives, which include the details of what kinds of consequences this kind of work can have under extreme conditions. When I say this kind of work, I mean security work and intelligence work on behalf of governments, corporations, or ad hoc, fleeting organizational structures. In all those years, many of them have shared stories about the trauma that they genuinely experienced, both because of the internal dynamics of the systems in which they worked, as well as the things that befell them, and how they could or could not, because of those systemic dynamics, deal effectively or not with the consequences of those situations. And I've decided after 21 years, and especially at an advanced age, and especially not having job security now, which is not worrying about that stuff in the same way, to tell the truth as much as I can about what I have heard and suggest strategies for dealing with the inevitable discoveries along the way for many of you of what this work can do to a person. Not to everybody and not in the same ways, but as a result, this talk is very personal and very deeply felt. And I hope it doesn't sound like a sermon because it is not intended to be moralistic. I am not going to be suggesting that I have any high moral ground because I don't. I'm affected by the consequences of the work, both others and my own as well. So there's no moralism in this. It's wanting to take a serious, clear look at what we have created in the national security state and the parts that make it up, and what some of the unseen consequences are. When I asked for input and feedback about this topic, a number of people said, this is something that is never discussed aloud out here. And it is discussed inside, and you know what I mean by inside, only in constrained ways that suit the mission and intention of the organizational culture, not necessarily the authenticity, integrity, and freedom of the individual human being. So if you walk into CIA, you will see the slogan, "The truth shall set you free." A very different way of interpreting the words of Jesus Christ, but ones that for the institution have been effective in terms of guiding the mission. Well, I'm going to pick up on those words and try to deliver some of the truth that sets us free as well, and I will need to be explicit. 21 years ago, when I first spoke here, I told the young people I saw, and the number of kids in the kids group, the Roots group that I spoke to yesterday, equaled the number of people at the entire conference at DEF CON 4. A little less than 400. And this year I understand there are about 25,000. And I said to the young people, who in those days looked like hackers, that is, wore the uniform of a more outlaw band than you see habitually today around the con, I said, if you want to hack, come in under the cover of NSA, come in under the cover of CIA. You will get the best tools, you will be taught the best techniques, and you will get cover for doing what would otherwise be illegal actions everywhere in the world, except this country. And all that has changed about that is now, of course, it includes this country as well. But I didn't know exactly into what I was inviting people. It was true, but I did not understand the full implications of what it would mean to make that commitment to doing that work. And I want to make a disclaimer. This is not an attack or intelligence agency bashing or anything like that. The people I've worked with who are colleagues in those places are generally good, well-intentioned people. This is about systemic issues that the entire system has generated in and of itself. I'm not the first one to know that things are different once you start doing the work than before you did it. Obama has said the rhetoric he used during his campaign about how he would change the instrumentality of surveillance and intrusion came immediately up against the rocks of reality the first day he was handed the intelligence briefing in the Oval Office. Because any sane human being, given that briefing and the 10 biggest threats against us, however you define us, would say, what can you do to stop these? And when you get the answer, we can do X and we can do Y and we can do Z, any one of us with a burdensome responsibility of protecting this country would say, then you do that. And so he did. And so he gave up a lot of the idealistic rhetoric about what he intended to do because he discovered he couldn't do it, not in good conscience. So what we're talking about is people dedicating themselves through security and intelligence work, i.e. you and your work, to bailing out the leaky boat of the 21st century country called America. And this is typical of what people said to me along the way. I was at NSA for X years, and I'm incredibly proud of my contribution. I grew up under the tutelage of the best and brightest I had the privilege of knowing. I don't believe the people or the agency are perfect, but they're the most intelligent, dedicated, and humble group of people you will likely ever meet. And whether or not you agree with that, that's how many people feel about what they discovered. And someone at CIA said to me, I didn't spend a lot of time on the pointy end of the stick, but I provided support to a lot, and I tried to learn and listen. And I'm very proud of my servants at CIA and the people I worked with. They were good, intelligent, reasonable, circumspect professionals. And I believe all of that is true. But this also is true, that the deeper truth, said clearly, will set you free. So this topic is a deeply serious issue, seldom explored out loud, certainly not out loud out here, where we airbrush away our complicity in what we have created and what we all sustain and are all complicit in sustaining. The nature of the work in and of itself can lead to situations and conditions that cause significant trauma or tie people into ethical knots or fray the bonds of trust, which are the substance and essence of a meaningful relationship with other human beings, or lead to substance abuse and divorce in higher numbers than the population experiences, and to suicide. That is not melodramatic. I will give you some of the issues in detail. This is what someone said to me who worked at CIA for some time and was extremely effective. What you're describing, they said, sounds oh so familiar. The trauma can last a long, long time. Those of us who worked counterterror before 9/11, and we were a ridiculously small number, had no time to grieve or otherwise deal with it at the time. Consequently, years later, we are still dealing with it. A psychiatrist I saw after 9/11 spoke of fighter-pilot syndrome. One is fine and appears to be coping well while the tension is still on. But once it lets up, your brain chemistry goes crazy. When bin Laden was killed, they said, I watched TV coverage of the party outside the White House for an hour, and I sobbed for the entire hour. Not because I regretted his death, which I did not, but because of everything that came before it. And this is the key part. It takes so long to train a good counterterrorist analyst. Yet managers are careless in burning out their people too quickly. And somehow we have to find a way to make it viable as a long-term job. That applies, I am told over and over again, to corporations, burning out their people in the same way, as well as the intelligence agencies and the security industry in many of its particulars. So we do have to attend, if we're vigilant, to the consequences of this work, and we have to care for ourselves and for others as if we matter and as if they matter. And to do that is a long-distance run, not a sprint. It's not an easy or quick fix. And this subject is huge and multifaceted. Any segment of this speech could be in another entire speech, but I want to hit the highlights. And if any of you want to discuss this further or talk about the issues, I invite you into conversation both in person and online. Cards will be available if you would like to do that. But first, let me say how the intelligence crossover leads into the InfoSec business. Because some people will say, I don't work for CIA. Some will say, I don't work for NSA. Some of you who work for CIA will say, I don't work for CIA. Some of you who work for NSA will say, I work for DOD, etc. But the crossover is significant. They might look different, but keep in mind, our special forces are currently in 170 countries. They are the oil in the machinery of our empire. And InfoSec and intelligence may not be that different once one is assimilated into the work and accepts contracts in, for example, false flag operations. We do not know who we really work for much of the time. Or when we do, we don't know what agreements they made with Intel. I'm sure not everyone who worked at Cisco knew that backdoors were being willfully installed in so much of the hardware, or that the big software manufacturers were doing the same for the software that they were shipping, or that crypto was being shortened significantly in key length by those who lied about what they were doing. We all work for the man one way or another if we're engaging in this economy and are trying to sustain what I call an empire, but it is. It's a global structure of transnational interaction. I'm sure I'm not the only one. I'm sure I should say it this way. I'm sure there are some in this room who have received paychecks with names on them that are not the ones really paying the bill. It's not all that uncommon. So let me start with a quote about that, and I have sanitized all quotes to protect both the innocent and the guilty. It occurs to me, one wrote, how severely the trajectory of my own career has taken me from an idealistic anarchist to a corporate stooge, to an ambitious entrepreneur, to military intelligence defense LE advisor. It's dramatic and surprising when I think about it. This is clearly the direction many take, and the national security state itself has become the water in which we all swim. So that context is implicitly the life of everyone else. So while an intelligence officer would probably have started out in LE or intelligence or defense, all of which are domains with a certain expectation of an extreme lifestyle, many cyber guys started out somewhere completely different than that. And then they somehow found themselves in the center of the military-industrial complex in ways they would never have prepared for. So the subject may be less common in security or cyber, but it is potentially more extreme in its impacts because the psychological makeup and life story of a cyber guy will not have prepared him or a girl, her, woman, her, for it. They're talking about their own life. Another said, when one joins an intelligence service at the start of a career, you do low-level apprentice-like tasks. In the course of your career, actions, decisions slowly grow into being almost imperceptibly for many. And you suddenly one day awake to where you are and realize that he or she has not been prepared for this, and realize, too, that one is now deeply into the situation and well beyond a point where one would have stepped into it if it had been presented as it was from the start. If this is the case, it is too late to turn back. So that same waking up moment applies to technologies that you work on and develop, whether they're weapons or genetic mods or total surveillance. There's always a tension, a friend at NSA said, because we can do something, should we? It's true of many technologies that once you start, you can't go back. And he added, some of us are smart enough or in on enough of what we are doing to be scared shitless of the possibilities of the trends that we see. And I want to just say that when someone tells you they're scared shitless, they're saying something serious and suggesting a potentially traumatic impact. More on that in a minute. One said to me, this is an InfoSec professional purely. I would literally go to sleep some nights wondering if tonight is the night I'm awakened by a page that said I'm owned. I would pray it would be a 0 day that is out of my control. What if it was something I fat-fingered? Maybe I'm not smart enough to do this job. So I pushed myself more and more. To attack, all you need is access to the internet. And according to the security community, the attacker always wins. So to defend, you just need to run a ship tight enough to keep out the internet. Therefore, it is a game you are set up to lose, and if you have any integrity at all, this will drive you bonkers. So the tension is between having integrity and staving off the insecurities of the work that can drive you nuts. So whether it's InfoSec or intelligence, you can play this game, but you can't win. Not if winning is defined as remaining free from the stresses that can have serious consequences. And one of my theses is that the national security state permeates all of society, and I'll just give lip service to that because I don't have enough time to cover everything I want to cover. a historical example. Way back in the 1960s, a young man named Gene Groves was thrilled to be engaged with the U.S. National Student Association, worked with student groups in other countries. And then Ramparts wrote an article uncovering the fact that the association is and had been a CIA proprietary, funded and sustained covertly by the agency. That revelation in the 60s, along with the revelation of many other proprietaries the CIA ran in the 50s and 60s, was a crisis for the agency because it had run free rein in the 50s and 60s, but also for American innocence. This young guy, Groves, seemed to be set for a great political career. But his work for the agency was unwitting, that is, manipulative and covert, and he didn't know how he was being used in the great game. And so he was used without being read into the script. And so when he found out what was up, he retreated into private life, and he said poignantly, "This world has lost its innocence for me. I want to get out." It's Chinatown, Jake. It's Chinatown. If you pay attention and engage with the best intentions in your work over the years, you will hear the whisper of that colleague, "It's Chinatown, Jake. Go on home. It's Chinatown." Which means this is about trust. Undermining trust in others, but above all in the fabric of your own life. They call it ontology, the structure of being, and epistemology, the structure of knowing. And what this can do is undermine your belief that you know who you are, and the role you are playing in your work and in the world, and that you know what's real. That's the key thing. It undermines your understanding of what is real. I've had people tell me things in this journey that pulled the foundation out from under what I thought as a smart guy I had put together as a feasible model of reality, and I found out once again that I was in the Hall of Mirrors and I didn't know what I didn't know. And when I found out what I didn't know in a way that pulled out that cornerstone of the whole edifice, it left me with profound anxiety and a serious case of secondary trauma because I didn't know how to handle not knowing what I thought I knew about reality itself and about the role I was playing in this great game. So, the betrayal of trust, this undermining of what we believe to be true of the world and our role in it, is one main theme. A friend of mine at NSA said he discovered that a program in which he participated wholeheartedly in the 1980s, only recently did he and his cohorts discover that the entire purpose of that program was not what they all believed it to be, but it was a covert cover story for an ulterior purpose for which the program was merely a support module, and they didn't know it for several decades. That undermined his understanding at the agency of what it was that he himself was doing. He told me of someone who came to work not long ago at NSA, who when they walked into work, discovered for the very first time that their parents worked at the agency. Now, what does that do to your sense of trust in a family if you find out that the foundational story of your family system has been, at best, a sin of omission, but possibly a lie? Now, inside, it's not a lie. You remember when Clapper was before Congress and he told them, "I said the least untruthful thing I could say." You know that inside the agency work, inside intelligence work, you are not lying. You are sustaining cover stories which are essential for the well-being, blah, blah, blah. And you are socialized and acculturated to believing that when you lie, you are not lying. Because you are lying on behalf of a bigger truth, which is the purpose of the agency itself. And the question becomes, is the agency a God worthy of worship? When you're through the looking glass, once through, can you come back? Here's what another friend said. It's kind of a funny story. I was always in trouble with my wife because the other wives knew more than she did. And I was the navigator and ops officer. My daughter, when she was in Air Force Intelligence Officer School, was out with my wife and friends. News brought up North Korea. She had to stop herself before she got into classified material. My wife pulled her aside and said, "Well, you can tell Daddy about it when we get home because he has a TS clearance." And the little girl said, "No, I can't. He doesn't have the need to know." And his response was, quote, "I smiled with pride when I heard that story." Because she was learning to be read into missions in a way that made it fun and clever and cute to lie to her own family, including her father, who had TS clearance, about what it was she did. Pride in the inability to tell the truth at home. So I'm illuminating the shaky basis for what we might think are essential transactions of a functional society. And the juicy stuff is yet to come. I like to quote Nietzsche. I'm just going to invite Nietzsche into the conversation. I'm not going to quote it because I don't have time, but the bottom line is he said, those things you want to believe are true are those which alleviate cognitive dissonance by giving you a story which feels better. And therefore truths that we agree are truths in orthodoxy are really illusions we have forgotten are illusions. They're metaphors that have become worn out and drained to their force. They're coins which have lost their embossing. In other words, undermining trust leads to a crazy-making experience. And when we try to build a coherent view of the novel, of the world, it makes us nuts. We find ourselves inside a Philip K. Dick novel. Trust, as you know, wrote one, is the coin of the realm in all human interactions. I observed people being quite withdrawn when trying to socialize with others outside the group in the know. It's all superficial. Good friends, if a person even has any, are only within the group or with people who have been in the group. Often it's attributed to a lack of social skills on the part of a stereotypical engineer, but that's a convenient, socially acceptable answer so they don't push back. The isolation of the individual in a context where due to compartmentation, clearances, need to know operational tempo, office politics, it's difficult to consult with any trusted or impartial mentor or peer to align your compass or get a second opinion, whether for operational issues or moral issues. So the individual is left to struggle in isolation with who to believe, what one's bottom line values might be, which can be different than what expected when one faces a real crisis of conscience, and what price is one willing to pay for staying true to whatever one clings to in such times, all in a context where a savvy individual knows he or she may not know the critical pieces of information which would change the picture in their decision entirely. In other words, it's crazy making. There are other symptoms of crazy making, one of which is that you need to be debriefed all the time. Listening to folks who've been through traumatic events once said, you get so wrapped up in their story that you need debriefing. And our standard practice is to debrief the debriefers. Now at NATO, we have a group that does nothing but study Russian propaganda. They're very, very good at flooding and saturating the Baltic states and the Scandinavian states and nearby areas with propaganda through multi-purpose attacks, subtle and covert. And so we have a group that studies that propaganda, but what they discovered was that even though that group knew what it was doing was reading the propaganda for the sake of analyzing the propaganda and responding to it, they nevertheless began to believe it because the part of the brain that believes takes in without a critical thought that which is presented as true, even though it is reading it critically with the prefrontal cortex and trying to understand what's going on. In other words, debriefing debriefers means we have to set up redundantly communities of redemption to help people get back on a saner track when they are caught in that crazy-making dynamic. Project Azorian reminds me of that. You remember Soviets lost a sub in the Pacific in the 70s. And the CIA created a proprietary, the Hughes company, to create a boat. It was undercover. The cover story was that it was looking for manganese nodules. The interesting thing about cover stories is that when they're layered properly, they are all true. It's just that each one is truer than the next. So we were looking for manganese nodules, and that was a useful thing to do, but that wasn't really what we were doing. We were trying to get that sub up. And when it came up, half of it fell back, we are told, and they got some incredible information from the rest, but not all of it. I talked to a man who was in a lead position in that endeavor, and he had to leave the issue shortly before they brought the sub up, just a matter of weeks. And he asked a friend who'd been part of it, so what did you discover? And he said, I'm sorry, you're no longer read into the project, sorry, and therefore you no longer have a need to know. Do you know that this is put together with tape? It's a kludge that wasn't effectively thought through, so that's why it's falling off. So I'll have to deal with that. So he couldn't be told until the rest of us were told what the real story of that was. But the problem is we don't know that that was the real story yet. We know we were told, now we can tell you the whole story, but we don't know if that was true. The work I did on the Gulf of Tonkin incident made perfectly clear how the CIA and the NSA were at odds about that. And I talked to the go-to radar guy who President Johnson said, we need to know if we were attacked by the North Vietnamese. And the guy said, we need the radar logs, we need this, we need that. And it'll take me about 48 hours. And the director of CIA told that to Johnson. Johnson said, I need to know in the morning. He said, we can't tell you in the morning. The science cannot be done. The forensics cannot be done in the morning. And he went back and told his colleague that, and he said, I can't do it in less than 48 hours. And the next morning, Johnson declared war on the North Vietnamese, and thousands, over 1 million lives, began to be slaughtered in that machine. The guy at CIA went back to the director and said, why wouldn't he let us do our work, which is intelligence? And the answer that came back to him was because he didn't want to know the answer. He wanted to go to war. So I asked the historian at the NSA, the lead guy, what can you and I discuss with confidence in the narrative we are sharing that we're talking about the same historical reality? And he said, anything up until 1945, because that's when the national security state got its wheels. He was kidding, but he wasn't kidding. So this permeates the psychosphere of the 21st century in our society. Take the metaphor into the InfoSec world. You often see attribution that clearly makes no sense. What's important, though, is not that it makes sense, but that you have attribution, and by attributing an incident to something, it allows you to close the loop, like Nietzsche said, with comfort and move forward. It looks like a cool and fun environment, doesn't it, InfoSec? But a lot of us, he said, aren't cut out to deal with the trials and tribulations. The longer you spend time, he said, the more jaded or apathetic or depressed you become. And in this hyper world I'm describing, our relationships and methods of communication with others fundamentally change. How is it that we come to speak to each other in a hyper-real world permeated by this sense of paranoia? More and more and more people will only speak to me about these issues in person, in crowds, walking in circles. I had someone, when I was going to do a speech in Amsterdam, say, I want to meet you. When I got off the plane, I took the train to the central station, Schiphol, to downtown Amsterdam Central Station. He met me at the train and rode with me to Rotterdam, where I was speaking for GovCert. And we talked a little on the train, and then we got off the train and walked in circles in the crowd, and then he got back on the train and went back to Amsterdam, where he lived. That's pretty extreme, isn't it, when you think about human behavior, which is meant to be spoken face-to-face, person-to-person. This is happening, in my experience, more and more because the paranoia permeates a society with so much intrusion and surveillance, not because of what it is doing, but because of what we're afraid it's doing or what we think it might be doing. Steve Miles wrote a book called Oath Betrayed when he used documents the ACLU had gotten about our torture in Iraq to discover that U.S. medical officers, doctors, were moving from torture to torture. And by torture, I don't mean waterboarding. I mean torture. The people I talked to who did this work spoke of oops deaths. You're working on someone and suddenly you go, oops, lost him. And the doctor falsifies a death certificate, making it sound like natural causes. And the doctor moves on to the next interrogation, which Steve Miles thought violated the Nuremberg provisions we ourselves wrote about using humans to experiment in ways that build on one another. I tried to interest the lead bioethicist at the AMA, the American Medical Association, in doing something about this in response to Miles uncovering the story. And he said, we don't touch that. But this is what happened to Steve. After a day of reading endless descriptions of arbitrary brutality, I dreamed I was in Abu Ghraib. I woke up sweating, my heart pounding. Later, I had so much sadness, and I just stopped working on it out of a sense of futility. He discovered, as I discovered at a certain point in my career, that we were victims of secondary trauma. Trauma caused by being ancillary to the act, but absorbing the act in an imaginative way. And his friends, he was advised to spend time with your family, spend time with friends, do gardening, listen to music. And he also told me personally just last week, he said, when I come back from disaster areas, I decompress on the way out in a non-affected part of the country so I can see that some parts of the world are lovely still. After horrendous times in Indonesia, Bosnia, Angola, I was restored only by participating in the everyday rhythms of life, going to coffee shops, having a beer at sunset for several days until I could function once again. Another told me I had to separate my life, my work life and my personal life. I increased my commute time. I was intentional about starting and stopping activities that were challenging emotionally. There's some of this work about living and working in the zone. How much personal do you let in? And how much do you have to remain in a robotic and automatic mode of acting? I came, she said, grateful that I did, from a public health wellness background so that I could deal with what was happening to me. But most of my colleagues are not trained in how to do that, and that's my point. Most of us in this work are not trained in what I call the human dimension of technology. When I offered this talk to Black Hat, it was turned down because I was told it was fluff. If the human dimension of our lives and work and very essence of our being is fluff, then fluff am I. Because I think these are, thank you. I think these are the critical issues which, as we age and the fun of the great game wears off, and the buzz of working on the edges and on the dark side and the light side and the gray side all at the same time, as that wears off. Well, I got a call one night from somebody at one of the agencies, and we spent an hour, and I had to tell him at the end of it what I used to say when I was in the ministry. This conversation did not happen. It only will be recalled if you bring it up. I cannot bring it up. I have to treat it as if I didn't hear everything you said in this hour. And then he got off the phone with some sense of what he had to do to resolve the terrible conflict he was up against between his work and his conscience. And I was left with it. This is why I know about secondary trauma firsthand. Paranoia sets in, and it leads to a constant sense of danger. A CIA worker said, paranoia sets in, you're always looking. Is someone following you? Are they watching with you? How many of you sit with your back to the wall in a restaurant? How many of you are habitually scanning the crowd for anomalies so you have an escape route planned in advance and can take action? I did that whenever I was on the ground in Israel. We had better learn how to do that on the ground in this country as well. But I begin every encounter with a new person, one said, in a state of distrust all my life. I have a standard line to bore people away from the topic of what I do so they won't ever ask incriminating questions. An NSA colleague said, I'm paid to think of as many possibilities as I can, to be sneakier than the sneakiest bastards in the world, because they'll throw everything at the things I design. I have to be professionally paranoid. Trust is difficult, especially for those of us who have to be distrustful because of the job. And on top of it, he added, we get screwed over by our bosses and coworkers as well. So, a ranking senior person at NSA said, yeah, I personally might be paranoid, but they are out to get us. And we have to act as if they are. Someone added, is there anybody in the rest of the world who sees me personally as a target? And if so, is it just business or is it personal? And what about all these great moralistic leaks from people whose names you know because of their righteous posture on the high moral ground? People were named whose lives are now at stake. The government keeps things so segmented, you think you're working on one project, but it's part of something bigger. And when Snowden outed you, it means the bad guys can learn who you are, and they won't just come after you, one told me. They'll come after your whole family. I was told that was the difference between the mafia and the Russian mafia, the Italian mafia. The Italian mafia will kill you. The Russian mafia will kill your whole family. It's great to know these distinctions, isn't it? But we do go after families. A guy who worked for many years for the CIA recruiting agents told me, I never put pressure on the agent I'm trying to recruit. What I do is find out where his kids are, and I try to put pressure on the kids. I find out where he works, and I put pressure on him at work. I find out about his wife, and I put a pressure on her covertly. And then as all those pressure sources build around him like wagons circling smaller and smaller, his crisis and anxiety, his sense of crisis and anxiety builds, and he falls into my arms. He comes to us. It's the nature of the work. The nature of the work. And when you have to let those people go because you're protecting friendlies, it causes many sleepless nights. A friend at, one of the agencies discovered that someone he had recruited was discovered and tortured and killed and he felt personally responsible for it, and he started drinking heavily. So he was stripped of his clearances and relieved of his major responsibilities and put into therapy to try to get him back. And I said to the guy discussing this, so is your goal to have him have greater integrity, authenticity, and freedom to function as a human being? And he laughed. He said, no, our goal is to have him do the job. And if he can't do the job the way we want, then we watch him very, very, very carefully. And sometimes what's done to you makes it difficult to do the job. I know someone who came to the agency late, and because of that was always suspect, because he hadn't been born and bred to the work. And so when there were significant leaks going on, he was suspected at once, and his clearances were stripped, and he was interrogated seriously and heavily, not tortured, but interrogated for over a year, until it was discovered that someone else had in fact been the source of the leaks. And so what did the agency do? They fired him. Because after what they had done to him for a year, they could no longer trust him not to work in good faith because of the resentment and anger he might feel as a result of his maltreatment. And he couldn't say to the outer world anything but, can you help me find another job? I have kids in college and I'm in my 50s. Because he had signed the agreements that keep you handcuffed and your mouth closed. Other things that get to people are like prolonged exposure to pornography, especially child pornography. At OSI, DOJ, I've talked to people who finally had to get away from the work because they looked at so much pedophile material. So living in fear, hypervigilant under constant threats, that creates trauma. High stress, said one. Hell yes. So, one said to me, how about being in a reality extensively where you're expecting to have your throat slit, get a knife in your back, and it's a normal day or night. Actually, the days weren't bad. The night is when it got scary. Or another, hacking into a government's computers. I knew that if my presence was discovered, the system administrator there would be tortured and executed for a failure to perform his duties, and I would bear the burden of that. Another said, what do you think it's like to hear your coworkers dying as they are bombed while manning listening posts in communication areas under manhole covers in foreign countries? No wonder it's not spoken of out loud or out here. I was just given a time thing. As a result of the conversations I've had with people, I have much more material than I can use, so I'm going to, again, try to move ahead and hit the high points. This trauma can lead to tears. I held in my arms while he sobbed a ranking person from NSA who was bereft because 11 people had died on a mission he had supported with his intelligence work. And what he kept saying is, I tried to do everything I could. Did I do enough? Did I do enough? Did I do enough? And because I had been in the clergy, I could pronounce words without potency of absolution and forgiveness. And when I wrote to him about the torture I was discovering we were doing and asked his opinion, he said, unless you have done it to the least of these my brethren, you have done it unto me. It has consequences. I killed people, he said. I tried. Is that enough? So it leads to ethical dilemmas when you're forced to make choices that can violate the course of action you're encouraged to take on behalf of the work. In those agencies, a strong conscience can be more dangerous than a mole because you are not as predictable. You may act according to your conscience. You may be considered not a team player. And as several have told me, you are not included in political and casual conversations anymore, only in technical, because you are no longer trusted to be, quote, one of us. The real moral burden for many, said Robert Steele after years at the CIA, is being complicit in crimes against humanity is the price for keeping our job. And Thomas Drake told me I was very publicly indicted under the Espionage Act. I was declared indigent by the court. I faced decades in prison. My life was turned upside down and inside out, and I have already lived a very dystopian, unwelling future. Oh, there were heartbreaks, said a CIA friend, when we couldn't warn a friendly about something bad likely to happen if it would jeopardize our sources and methods and our assets and their safety. We talked about these things many times. We never took them lightly. But still, it can be hard to sleep at night when you don't tell people what's going to happen and others die as a result. Who pays the price for this? The people doing them. But can we stop doing these missions in the world in which we inhabit? No. But we can take care of the people we put into these positions. We can take care of them differently. In drone work, you know, the U.S. Air Force is finding similar cognitive dissonance to what I'm describing in crews that get up in a normal family routine, go to work, go into war, come home again. They walk into the office, they're at war. They walk out and go home, and they're walking into an entirely different world. This one used the metaphor of scuba diving. When you come up, you need to decompress. They risk physical damage and even death if they come up too fast. The Air Force is working on approaches to decompress the drone crews and others who do work like it. It carries over to InfoSec. I remember a guy finding in light of a major breach, they found him sobbing at his desk because he thought he would lose his job and he had so much at stake. A friend said he had confronted the face of evil. We lighten the taxonomy of hacking, serious dark side hacking, by making it something other than what it is. Those who encounter it in a way that destroys their lives or careers are looking at the face of evil. And what else does it do? Trauma creates numbing, and numbing means a lack of relationships, and that means divorce. I talked to a guy in another country. I said, how does your work affect you? He said, 2 divorces. My dad, said another, announced to the family when I was 38 he'd been a special agent from before he met and married my mom. He changed his identification. None of us knew who he were. His secrets were buried with him. I came to visit Mom. She met me at the door and said she's filing for divorce because she could never again trust Dad. The dehumanization of others leads to the dehumanization of self. There's an enormous personal and professional price that we are paying. I was eyewitness to super secret executive decisions after 9/11 that I knew had enormous strategic consequences, said this guy at CIA. I stared into Pandora's box and the abyss stared back. But I exercised my moral agency and became a truth teller and a whistleblower, refusing to break faith or fidelity with the oath I took in defense of the Constitution at an enormous price. What is that, 5 minutes? No, 5. Yeah. 5. Come on. When I was a high-performance case officer, said Robert Steele, after 9 years, good years, the CIA, I had 5 times the regional average in recruitments. I was very productive. And I observed the Personnel Management Working Group and the Directorate of Operations, the DO. I noted they were exceedingly proud of having the highest rates of alcoholism, adultery, divorce, and suicide in the government. I personally, now think of this, have 23 professional suicides in my mental logbook. The first was an instructor who blew his brains out when I was in training. The latest are senior figures who could not live with what they knew. So, the conditions are created, the impact happens, the consequences take place, and then what? Are you treated inside? Well, you can only go to a therapist who's been cleared to hear you. I said this sort of thing at a talk at Source Boston a few months ago, and a former head of the IAD at NSA was in the audience. She said, I've never had these issues. People came to me all the time with their problems, and I said, you go wherever you want. And I said, and could they discuss the work issues? She said, well, of course not. And I said, but it's the work issues that are the problem and the source of their distress. And she looked off into the distance as if she had never given that a thought before. Michael Hayden, when he was at CIA, started working on marriages because, quote, he suspected there was a high rate of divorce. We can't get the figures out of them about what kind of divorce there is. But you need to have third-party mediation in those situations and in ethical issues. You can't leave an ethical issue in the hands of the person who has a stake, money on the table of that game, because then they'll make a decision on behalf of the system and not on behalf of the well-being of the person. So, to work with an individual in a crisis of conscience would be, said one at NSA, alleviate their pain and get them back to work, and watch them carefully if we suspect them. So is it laughable, I said, to think a psychiatrist inside can work with someone having a crisis of conscience? And he said, it is indeed laughable. It is indeed laughable. Stansfield Turner, CIA, said, huge problem with alcoholism. I think everybody kind of knows this if they know anything about it and choose to look. But he rejected an article on the subject because he said to my friend, the writer, quote, it's a problem, but we don't want to talk about it. Well, what I'm trying to make A decision to do is talk about it after 20 years of listening to this. There are consequences to what we do and what we choose to do, and there are strategies we can devise that help us sustain ourselves when we find ourselves at these various crossroads. You need friends. And what I've said is that often people tell me they can't, because of deception and deceit, have real friends because they can't disclose the truth of who they are, or fear what their coworkers or family or friends would think if they disclosed who they were. But without close friends, without people, even in the agency, and people are encouraged at CIA to marry other agents in the CIA, because no one else will understand what's happening to them. You need family and friends, and do gardening and music and yoga and meditation. I don't want to get religious on you, whoop-ass on you, but the fact is that meditation and the spiritual tools that have been discovered for thousands of years help. They let you become more fully present and conscious to yourself, which is a primary antidote, according to Van der Hoek, a major source of expertise on trauma, an antidote to what trauma does to your body and where it goes and what it does to you. You can become fully present to yourself once again, both feel your body and feel your mind, and be present mentally and emotionally and spiritually to yourself, and then you can make decisions in full force and conscience. You can write about it. A friend, Susan Hassler, wrote a novel called Intelligence that just rages with white heat. She is so angry at the agency, but it's the only way she could talk about it. She couldn't talk about it out here. You can come here and find, if you can, the people you need, as I have for 21 years. Our existence here is paradoxical, said one, and we try to frame it as either a professional life or an online persona or a hacker handle or family mode. But DEF CON is unique, he concluded. This place is where all our lives and paradoxes collide into one gigantic fireball of intense existence. And let's face it, we are hooked on that reality. You wouldn't be in the game if you didn't love the game. But all I'm saying is you need to be mindful and vigilant of what the game can do, and find strategies and alternatives to letting it eat you up. Because the places for which you work, whether government or corporate, have one goal in mind. The newspaper The Onion, my best source of news today, once said, quoting a customer service representative, "Our customers are our second most important focus," by which they meant, of course, that money and power were the first. And that's the way the systems work. So I'm going to conclude by saying, well, I have to say always, buy my book. It's irrelevant to this talk, but buy my book. You got to get that in somewhere. And it's anomalous, but there it is. I'll be doing a signing tomorrow of UFOs in government. And I have a whole section in here that I didn't touch on what it does to people to have a genuine UFO encounter, and what it does to traumatize them because they can't speak about it to anybody else without being thought crazy or insane. And the other book is Foam, a novel. And I began writing fiction again when a friend at NSA said, "You can't talk about this stuff unless you write fiction. It's the only way you can tell the truth." So I refer you to my last several speeches here. One is on the UFO book. One is on fiction is the only way to tell the truth. And tomorrow at noon up in the DEF CON suite, I'll be signing or talking about books or just hanging out. And above all, come up and get a card if you want it. I am always available. Ping me if you want to talk. Ping me if you want to email. Ping me if you want to walk in a circle in a crowd in a foreign city where no one knows your name, except the people who are watching you. I belong to this community. I genuinely belong to it. 21 years is not an accident, especially at the pay rate, right? You come because you love it, and because you derive so much more value than you ever deliver. So my stake in the game is to be committed to letting what I once called in a different profession the power of love speak, the truth that sets people free. And if anybody wants to have those conversations or find a way to be directed to where those conversations can happen, just ask me about it. And thank you so much for your attentiveness. Thank you.
I want to give you a big hug right now because what you spoke about has so many pervasive impacts.